Up next, we're going to be taking a look at everyone's favorite topic, crisis communications, but under a different lens. Our next panel, Time's Up and hashtag #MeToo, Navigating Crisis with a Social Movement, will take us to the headlines that bring companies, industries, and markets to their knees. We'll explore how unpredictable environment is impacting brands and purchasing decisions, especially with crises that are tied to major social movements. Okay, everyone, let's give a round of applause to our panelists, Seth Arenstein, editor at PR News, Melissa Agnes, author of Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World, Andrew Blum, a PR consultant at AJB Communications, and our moderator, Carrie Flynn, reporter at CNN. I also would like to announce that you will be receiving a survey on Thursday, so following the conference, and the first 10 people to fill out the survey will receive Melissa Agnes's book, Crisis Ready, Building an Invisible Brand in an Uncertain World. Thank you.
Hello, testing. Awesome. Well, that was a lovely introduction. I was going to have the panelists introduce themselves, but I guess I don't necessarily have to. Though I guess, is there anything she missed from your intros? Anything else you wanted to add? We're good? Okay. No speeches at first. Okay, awesome. Well, let's get right into the topic. Really happy to be joined by this group today and talking about something that I guess everyone here, a PR professional, knows is a really important topic in your field. I hope it's not something that you have to gripe with every day when it comes to the word crisis, but it's something to know about. So I'm happy to have this panel of experts to kind of talk through it. So what I wanted to start with is one thing that's the title of this panel is talking about Time's Up and Me Too. Obviously, as we were just talking about before, this idea of like sexual harassment and sexual misconduct in the workplace, at events, everywhere, is nothing new. At the same time, we now have these words, Time's Up and Me Too, that are really kind of elevating the conversation. And I would love to kind of have you guys explain the ways that maybe it's changed crisis PR and the ways that it's stayed the same.
Well, one of the things, and I think Andrew has written about this, so it's not an original idea that I have, but it's changed it tremendously because in the quote, old days, when there was a PR crisis, you had time to react. With Me Too, sometimes you're gone the next day, right or wrong. So it has put a lot of PR people out of business in the sense that they can't even react.
So that's kind of two things. One, I'm really hesitant to use the term crisis PR because crisis is a crisis. No, that's not on you. That is actually wonderful that you bring it up. Because a crisis is a crisis. PR is a facet of crisis management, a very important one, but a crisis is a crisis. If it's a crisis PR, it's probably a viral issue. It's not a crisis. One. And then two, the times have changed. So everything you've said, Seth, is true, but it's not the Me Too movement that initiated this change of real-time management and real-time crisis. So those are my two kind of comments on that one.
That's great.
Seth, thank you for the plug there. But I think what changed was, I thought I had it on, no?
But you have to put it to your mouth.
Oh, okay. See how you also use microphones in media training, right? It changed with the immediacy of the shunning and the firing of these people, mostly men. Some of them deserved it, some of them maybe didn't deserve it, but it changed how you react as a crisis team, and it also changed what you can do. If a guy is fired and shunned and kicked out the door and is hiding under a rock, you can't help him right then. And then you had these supposed comebacks of Mario Batali, even Charlie Rose and Matt Lauer have been saying, oh, I can come back. No, they can't. Not one of them wanted to go on a panel like this with TV cameras rolling and interview other Me Too men. That is a ridiculously stupid PR idea. PR still has a place in this problem, but maybe it's further down the road. It can't be immediate.
So let me add to that. These kinds of allegations and this type of high-risk scenario, okay, is something that should be considered and talked through with leadership prior to it ever even surfacing or being, a possibility of surfacing. For precisely these reasons. So this thing, all of this emerges very quickly, but it's also very emotionally driven, and it segregates. It's very controversial. It's emotional inside in terms of internally, and it's emotional externally, which drives that virality factor and the impact factor. So having these discussions now and saying, okay, what does, and it goes with the whole concept of crisis readiness, is looking at societal trends, like cancel culture is another one, is another hot topic right now, and that fits into this a little bit. So looking at these societal trends and saying, how might this present risk and or opportunity to our organization? And what does that look like? So if this is a high-risk scenario, if this is something that could come to light for us, or maybe we have a cultural crisis and we're realizing that if this comes to light, kind of just brings things up to the surface, which is a good thing. And looking through and defining those thresholds. So at what point would something like this, or anything, be an issue versus a crisis? Having those defined for your organization, those definitions defined, and then the thresholds of at what point does something get escalated to crisis level, and what does that mean? At what point would we need to stand behind somebody, for example? Or at what point do we need to disassociate our brand in protection of the brand, and why? And making sure that the answers to that are thought through prior to the emotion setting in, because emotion clouds judgment, and that the answers to that are always, always in alignment with the values for which your brand represents.
I love what you're saying there, Melissa. It's like this idea of like, we just threw out crisis out here, but actually taking a step back and understanding what crisis means for your organization, because the definitions can be different. Seth, I saw you listening and nodding there. I was wondering if you had anything to add, and maybe like a case study too. I know maybe not a personal one, but a way that you've seen, and at the same time, maybe in your past, of that defining of like, okay, what is an issue? What is a crisis? And what's that line?
Oh, yeah, well, getting off the Me Too subject, though, look at perhaps Boeing with the two crashes, okay? So the first crash is in a country way, way, way far away from the United States. About 150 people are killed. It gets almost no coverage in this country. But all the elements that we're talking about now with Boeing are there if you look. I mean, the reason I know is I wrote about it. I'm an old aviation guy, and I remember this crash, and I said, oh my gosh, because this could really be a communications issue, because the pilots' unions were saying, oh, well, there's this new software in the Boeing 737 MAX 8, and Boeing didn't really tell us much about it. So that was one strand, but you know what? That happens all the time with crashes. So, there's always finger pointing. But I just remembered all this.
So I guess for that example, like, would you say like the first, like the crisis should have been identified as a crisis sooner rather than later?
Yes. I mean, Boeing basically said, no, we don't have any problem with this. This is a very, very safe aircraft. I hate to say it, but there was an element of racism here too. They were saying, well, those pilots at that airline, which was, I believe it was what was it? Malaysia? Was it in Ethiopia? They're not well trained. That was the if you read between the lines, that's what they were saying. They were saying this is a perfectly good plane, and the pilots were not trained well. So Boeing did not, Boeing was closed-mouthed about this. This was not a crisis. This was a bad day, not a crisis. Well, bad day, 175 people died, but it's not a crisis. And they took away all the criticism. The next crash happens. I'll never forget it. It was a Saturday night, Sunday morning here. I got up early, I looked at the news. It was a foxnews.com story. And they're talking about this next crash. 175, almost 200 people are killed on a Boeing jet. And I go to myself, I wonder if it's the same jet that crashed, 6 months ago. Now, in that initial story, they didn't make that connection. I go back to my own story on my computer, and I look at, it's the same plane. And still Boeing really didn't really admit much was wrong. And now, of course, months and months and months later, yes, they had no choice, and they're saying, oh, yes, it was, we should have done this differently, we should have done that differently. The FAA obviously is being pulled into this, looking not so good at this point. The onion has been peeled back, and we find now that the FAA has a very cozy relationship, not only with Boeing, but with others. And they're not, the regulators aren't really regulating as much as sort of overseeing.
Well, they were self-regulated.
Yeah, they were essentially self-regulating. So, there was a case where you really did have a real bad crisis.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
How you prepare your organization
Yes,
or yourself
absolutely.
for a crisis hasn't changed.
No.
Okay? It's what the crisis is and how it plays out quickly or slowly and how you are allowed as a PR person to help deal with it. But often you have a company or a public figure thinks, oh, I can just snooker the media.
Right.
They won't care. So, and sometimes an organization ought to know what's going on. Newsrooms, like a lot of media outlets had Me Too problems. Newsrooms, having worked in one years ago, maybe a lot of you have too, they're notorious. Everyone gossips. Everyone knows what everyone's doing. These newsrooms, if they didn't know for sure they had a problem, they should have known, and they should have prepared, and they didn't, some of them. So now you have Ronan Farrow out with his book on Me Too and other things. NBC is in the toilet on PR. They have to report this book, and they have to defend themselves, and they've got themselves in a corner.
Well, maybe let's use that as a case study of response. And I know we're not internal there, and I work at CNN, not NBC. But I'm curious about that kind of the comeback story that we saw recently with Matt Lauer. I woke up early one day last week, and this long apology, I shouldn't even say apology, this long memo from Matt Lauer, in response to Ronan Farrow's book. I'm curious, your perception, is that a good way to do crisis PR, to look at what you have, a book, and be like, okay, how do we respond to this, and write this long memo that you then send out to reporters like myself. Is that appropriate? Is that a good case study?
I didn't actually read it,
That's
so I
probably
can't
good.
comment on it. No, I would love to comment on it, but I haven't read it yet. So.
And his lawyer, I know, helped him put it together. And I think the reason he spoke about it was because now it wasn't just consensual, it was a rape charge.
Right.
And so he felt he had to speak out. I don't think it helped him. I don't think he's coming back for a long time. I don't even know if he has a PR person. But I have dealt with some of these high-profile people who wanted PR, and then the shit hit the fan, and they got fired the next day, and they said, no, I can't even talk to you. So we have to figure out, does PR have a role at all in these 24-hour crisis and firings, or do we have to wait until they're ready for a comeback, or do we have to revamp how our PR is run? These are questions, and then there's a moral side to this. Do we want to be involved representing the Weinsteins of the world? I personally could not do PR for Weinstein. That's my choice. But other people, maybe they need PR and should have PR helping them.
So all of these questions are really, really strong, and are part of what I was saying earlier, that need to be brought to the table prior to ever experiencing these, because these are the answers in the moment are going to be fueled with emotion, because no matter what, if it's somebody, if it's a colleague, if it's somebody, if it's leadership, there's emotion tied to that. It's human beings that that you work with, or that leadership sits at the board tables with. And on that note, there's a couple things that you guys said that I want to kind of just elaborate on for the sake for all of you. Is there are two things that need to happen when a crisis strikes in order to successfully manage it. The right actions need to be taken, and the right communication strategy needs to be put into effect. Both of these things need to happen simultaneously and really, really well. You cannot manage a crisis successfully with doing either one of these things, or less, in one of these areas. And so to the Boeing point, Boeing has a systemic problem with this particular flight or aircraft. And they tried to, looking at action and communication, they were silent. They also didn't take action. Maybe that's a terrible example. Up until the point where they realized that they absolutely need to, because everything about the brand was diminishing, right? They were losing brand equity. Their stock price was plummeting. So those two things. And then, Carrie, you had also asked us to define issue versus crisis. So if I could just do that quickly to
Please
kind
do.
of bring everybody on the same page. So a crisis is a negative event or situation that stops business as usual to some extent because it requires immediate escalation to leadership. Now, to Andy's point, you guys, PR needs to be at that crisis management table. You need to have a seat there. You need to have your strategy and your expertise brought to that table. But so stops business as usual to some extent, needs to be escalated straight to leadership because it threatens long-term material impact on one to all of the following 5 things. So people, stakeholders, whether it's internal and or external, the environment, the business's operations, its reputation, and or its bottom line. Negative event with long-term material impact on any one to all of those 5 things. Whereas an issue is also a negative event or situation that doesn't stop business as usual because it's basically, I see it as business as usual on hyperdrive. It's your guys' it's the unpleasant part of your guys' job, but it doesn't require taking leadership straight out of their busy day, out of their meetings to get their eyes in decision-making and directives on the subject because it doesn't threaten that long-term material impact on any one of those 5 things. And so the whole point, I think it's so important to know those definitions beforehand because today, an issue can go viral and not amount to crisis level, and yet can feel like a crisis in the moment. And by not classifying it, categorizing it properly, you risk a wrongful response in both action and communication, or one of the two. So if you guys want to add to any of that.
Thanks for that. Anything to add there, Seth?
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, I think, you pointing out to me about language is so important. People say, oh, I'm in a crisis right now. Today. They're in crisis every day. Come on, you're not in a crisis every day. And that goes to your point. I mean, you're absolutely right. And you're right, you have to know when crisis starts and when an issue starts. When you're in an issue, when you're in a crisis. And you're right, to have all this preparation and to know XYZ thing is going to happen. And yes, we're now in a crisis situation. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
I agree. I'd like to add that I think what Me Too should have taught us as a society and as corporations and brands is, yes, you have to be ready for a crisis. You should have a crisis team put together, have had meetings, have had crisis drills.
Absolutely.
Maybe have a crisis agency on retainer, all these things just to prep in case it happens one day. And it seems to happen out of nowhere a lot of times. Now, if you're a one-person entity like a Matt Lauer, unless you admit to yourself that I'm doing this, I'm not preparing for all this. I'm blind to it all, and it hits me, and I go hide in the sand. So there's 2 different sides to a crisis, the organization and the person. And, of course, the victims. That's a whole separate issue.
Absolutely.
We can talk a lot about, but
Absolutely.
20 minutes.
Right.
Well, I'm curious that side of what you were just describing of that you talked about having a crisis team on staff. I'm curious the kind of that line where you are like, okay, this is a real crisis, all hands on deck, versus, okay, actually we have this team of 3 people. To give an example from my perception is like, I've covered Facebook for many years now, and there was a time where I would work with PR professionals, and I was like, oh, cool, yeah, we talk about XYZ, and then all of a sudden I felt like everyone I spoke to worked in crisis comms. And I just felt like, okay, that's maybe their strategy internally is everyone is able to do that. Do you think, would you advise that's typical of any like brand or agency in-house or external?
I don't know what you think, Melissa. I'd love to hear what you and Andy think, but I heard one point on just this very topic when somebody was saying, well, you get a crisis team together. You say you're getting like 6 or 7 people, communicators, perhaps a lawyer, maybe somebody from investor relations, and you bring in the CEO. Don't do that at the beginning, because are you likely to tell the truth to the CEO? If the place stinks, if you were sitting there at Boeing, would you have told the Boeing CEO, hey, come on, we've got 2 crashes, we've killed 400 people, we've got to do something? Would you have done that?
I hope so, because they needed somebody to do that.
True, but I guess the point that this person was making was, if you have a lower level person that you feel more comfortable talking to, perhaps, initially at least, that's the person to be in that first crisis group. Then eventually, stronger, more senior people would go to the Boeing CEO and say, hey, baby, we've got a problem here.
So crisis readiness is cultural. One of the biggest things that I see happening, which is what we need to start steering away from, is a department or a subset of people within an organization is tasked with creating a crisis management plan, which is language that, if you read my book, I really don't like. It's a crisis-ready program that is embedded into the culture of the organization. And that plan sits on a shelf and does a disservice to everybody involved, and mostly people don't even know of its existence. So in terms of who to bring to the table, what you're talking about, Seth, is an assessment group. When you are determining whether or not this is an issue or a crisis, you have to have an assessment group, a working group basically, of a team of specific people that should be formalized, part of the governance structure, and they sit down and they say, okay, 360 degrees, what's the risk and impact here? Is this crisis level or is this issue level? And then, protocol dictates what happens next. Crisis level, absolutely, leadership is pulled in. I just went through that. With regards to who's at that table, that goes to governance, that goes to kind of the structure of the organization, but every single stakeholder, this is kind of the biggest takeaway, every single stakeholder needs to have a seat at that table, whether it's at that board table or just whether they are being called in to have that lens. So as an example, HR frequently doesn't have a seat at that table. As a result of that, employees, one of the most common grievance that I hear from HR directors and employees is we are an afterthought. When something happens, everybody thinks about investors, they think about customers, they think about the media, they don't think about us. Putting HR at that table makes sure that they have representation, that employees have representation, and they are not overlooked in that heat of the moment. So if you wanted to add to that.
I agree. You're not going to bring the CEO into an initial crisis team meeting, but there are times when something hits the fan, and sometimes it's an issue, like you said, and sometimes you know a crisis when you see it. That's sort of a take on a cliche, but you'll know it, and you've got to get ready. And the wild card here is that if there's a huge crisis, the media is going to keep digging into it and keep digging, and I'm going to say keep digging 20 times. I've had clients who didn't get that. I've had clients who emailed reporters when we're on a zero-comment lockdown in a crisis. Trump doesn't get it. The media is going to investigate him until he's out playing golf for the rest of his life. They're not going to give up. That's the problem with the crisis. They pick and they find other stuff that wasn't in the first crisis. And you weren't prepared for that. I've had to make spreadsheets of allegations that kept on coming in because the media found it out. And that's where the team has to sit with the team and the lawyers and the client and say, how do we deal with these issues? Sometimes you want to say no comment without saying no comment. Sometimes you want to give it a total denial. I've had times on Twitter where I haven't wanted to make it worse, so I didn't even tweet anything. So these are all things to think about when you're before a crisis and the middle of a crisis.
I guess I want to take a step back and talk a little bit. I know we kind of talked about how to make a preparedness team and how to maybe avoid crisis because you understand kind of what your team does and how to respond pretty fast in this day and age. But I guess I'm curious from your perspective, is there any way to completely avoid it? When it comes to sexual misconduct, you could be representing someone and you don't actually know. So there's no way to avoid having worked with said individual. But what about those other issues? What about, the topic of diversity and gender equality? What about other maybe moral decisions? Should agencies and brands be wary of trying to avoid those situations completely?
So every organization, I don't care what industry, what sector, how big or small you are, as well as every human being, right? Organizations are made up of human beings. That's the common denominator. Every single organization has a series of high-risk scenarios. So most likely high-impact issues, most likely high-impact crises. When you identify those and you do a deep dive, go through the deep dive process into each one of those, yes, you can you find every layer of preventable incidents for those scenarios, and there's no excuse to not prevent the preventable because it's right there in the name, they're preventable. And then, but not every risk is preventable. So then looking at, okay, at what point, or, human factor risk, right? You can have the best culture internally. You can have the strongest leaders that are just the best human beings on this planet, and somebody makes a mistake and something happens because they're human beings. So human factor is always a risk. And then that's what comes to when it's not preventable, when we've taken every measure to prevent and we've put ourselves in the best possible position, we are also ready to manage the unpreventable and manage it in a way that doesn't just mitigate escalation or mitigate long-term material impact, but the whole point, my whole concept of crisis readiness is coming out of any negative event with increased brand equity. So that means that you understand every single one of your stakeholder groups. You understand exactly what they expect in the organization. You understand the whole concept between taking the right actions and communicating effectively simultaneously so that you manage any negative incident, whether it's an issue, a day-to-day issue, or a viral issue, anywhere on that range of that scale, straight through to catastrophic crisis. How do you manage it in a way where you are meeting, if not exceeding, expectations of those who matter most to the business? All of those answers, so I look at crisis readiness as this kind of like this big giant puzzle, right? It really is a puzzle. It's just like a total map of a puzzle. But let's say that the puzzle, the completed puzzle, which is your crisis-ready culture or your ability to manage any type of negative event, is in a puzzle box, right? And you open up this huge puzzle box of 2,500 pieces, and there's tiny little pieces, and you go into the middle of a windstorm, and you open that box and you throw it into the air. Collecting those pieces in order to create that crisis-ready program is your task, is part of the deep dive process. And every single one of those pieces currently exists within your organization. So understanding who your stakeholders are, understanding what their expectations are, understanding what actions need to be taken to prevent the preventable, and then to be ready and take shape when the unpreventable, if the unpreventable happens. All of those pieces exist. You just have to go digging for them.
And the digging sometimes is very unpleasant.
But so opportunistic.
Absolutely.
And so positive.
Absolutely.
And goes to strengthening culture and productivity and efficiency and
question.
morale. And there's so many positive, the best things in life are not the easiest things, but they're worth doing.
Right. That's why Chipotle may be the most sanitary restaurant on the planet Earth today. I mean, it might be. I mean, they've done so much to rectify their issues. Maybe the best place to eat in terms of sanitary conditions.
But you just proved the point that you have to fix something,
Right.
and you have to maintain
Absolutely.
it. For years, Tylenol
Yes.
was the gold standard in PR.
Right.
How they dealt with the crisis. Now, Johnson & Johnson, which makes Tylenol, is in the middle of the opioid epidemic.
Yep.
Which brings me to I'll throw this out for thinking or wondering. Does the PR team need a seat at the business table for the reason of thinking about what they're doing? The Johnsons, they couldn't have foreseen the opioid epidemic, but they might have thought about what's it going to do to people. Because now it's a crisis, and they're not the golden child like they were back in Tylenol days.
So I love that, and I'm going to add to that for you guys. I would say yes, only if you are also empowering yourselves and taking the responsibility of looking at the risk. So how many times do we see a PR campaign or a marketing campaign go out, which nobody even took, there wasn't a systemic approach built into the process that said just the simple questions of how can this be misinterpreted? How can this be misconstrued or misunderstood? Whereas then we see the marketing campaign or the PR campaign go completely viral, right? Viral issue, not crisis, but unpleasant nonetheless, that could have entirely been mitigated had those questions been posed at the drawing table. So yes, have a seat, but bring that with you to that seat.
Right, there are a lot of other things to bring to it. But in the news business, let's take Roger Ailes. You know how he ended up with his harassment. He was known to be a harasser. Now, how well known he was, I don't really know. But the question is, in a newsroom situation, do they need to bring the employees in more if they're bringing in a high-profile anchor? Do they need to revamp their hiring practices now? Because it was rampant. A lot of the first Me Too situations were the news business. And I've worked in newsrooms, and yeah, they're bad places. I didn't know they were that bad. But maybe something needs to be done, because then, by the time the PR person comes in later, it's too late. Mm-hmm. There was no input into the decision making. So,
also speaks to culture. Cultural crises are amongst the most difficult to manage because they're so deep-seated. And to manage that, culture starts at the top, and then it is enforced bottom up. So that action that needs to be taken is often change of leadership. So, PR comes into a lot of messes, to your point, that needed the right lens, needed the right strength to mitigate them in the first place.
When I meet with a client who's not a crisis client, the first thing I ask them is, what do you hope to accomplish? Then I ask them, what's the best thing they've ever had in PR? And then I ask them, what skeletons are in their closet? Is there a crisis brewing? Was there one last month? I mean, you have to dig, because you could take a non-crisis client, and the next thing you know, you're in the middle of a crisis, which you hadn't planned on, which sometimes can mean a lot more resources, a lot more time, a lot more effort. And the good thing about a crisis is you can charge more money if you're in PR.
Yeah, I think a good recent example I've been watching is like WeWork. Like, I think it's a great example of a company whoever did their PR was like the good days for a while, and like every story was positive, and now my feed and what I'm reading and every news outlet ever is writing like 10 negative stories a day about WeWork, because to your point, there are so many skeletons just in the closet that were waiting to come out.
And negative news is, I hate to say it, is more appetizing a lot of the times. It sells papers, doesn't it?
Well, or it's just at the same time, I guess I would argue on behalf of news.
Yes.
It's like also like people didn't necessarily know
Right.
that there were skeletons in the closet because
right.
maybe a PR team was really good at
Right.
keeping those in the closet.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
They weren't told, yeah.
Well, and to your point, Seth, yes, we live in a world of reality television, right? So our society loves drama. But I would back with all of myself, every single time that human beings, more than we love drama, we love a happy ending. We love the happy stories. So I think that that's worth kind of bearing in mind when you might get discouraged with all of the drama that we listen to and we see.
Since we're talking about drama and crisis and PR, the second season of Succession on HBO, I don't know if anybody's watched it, but it's all about PR crises. It's quite entertaining for people like you in the room. And yeah, it really is. It's all about a PR crisis. Actually, crisis and crisis, one after the other. Some are kind of known, and plenty of them come out of the closet, and it's just wonderful. And it's somewhat realistic. There are a couple of things that are fairly realistic in it, I thought. Anyway.
The other thing with these happy endings that we want as a culture or society is we put people up on pedestals and then we knock them down and then we let them back up. Now, are some of these Me Too people ever going to come back up? I don't know. Should PR help them? I think it's a case-by-case situation, I think.
I would say, I'll go out on a limb, and I would say there's a money factor here. So, for example, with Roseanne, her activities on social media were definitely known by ABC before they hired her. They hired her anyway. They made a lot of money. Then at a certain point, they realized, oops, this could really hurt. Roseanne's tweeting could really hurt us. And she was gone. So I think if a entertainment company decides that Kevin Spacey or Matt Lauer or, let's say, Louis C.K. can make us some money without really damaging us for X amount of time, they will come back.
It's a huge difference.
They are toxic.
I understand that there will be a calculus there'll be a calculation. Yes, we know people are going to boycott us. For example, Colin Kaepernick. Nike backs him. They know X amount of people are going to burn Nike shoes. They're going to say Colin Kaepernick is terrible. The person in the White House was one of them. But they also knew that
Thank you.
True.
Thank you.
Definite. No question about it. No question about it. Good point. But I'm just looking at it at a very gross level. You're right, though. Your point is very well taken. Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem is not Kevin Spacey or Matt Lauer or any of these other people with the Me Too thing. That's absolutely true. I just feel that there's I hate to say it, but there's a kind of a cold-hearted look with money. And I think if people believe that Kevin Spacey will make us money and not hurt us as much, and he'll make, the calculation, how much is he going to make, how much is he going to hurt? And if it's positive, they'll do it. I hate to say that, but I think that's where it's going to go. I mean, not anytime soon, but down the road, yeah.
I hate to say, you could be right.
Yeah. I hope I'm wrong,
But we
yeah.
also have politics, and we've had a lot of politicians who have done horrible things to women, and there have been a lot of allegations about the current occupant of the White House.
Absolutely.
And here we are talking about it. Here we are talking about it, and we have a president who with the pussy grabbing tape,
Yep.
and that goes on, and we're still trying to deal with the corporate and the news media and these other issues. I don't know. What's the resolution of this, Seth? Maybe, or you might have an idea.
Well,
How do we deal with this?
to me, it's such a great conundrum, and it's a wonderful thing to talk about. It's an awful topic, but it's so interesting. I find, for example, I mean, you know, I hate to keep harping on Boeing, but I can't believe the CEO is still employed as the CEO. All right, they just took away his chairman of the board title over the weekend, I think very quietly on Friday night or Saturday, so it didn't really get much coverage, but he lost that title, but he's still CEO. The governor, the lieutenant governor of, and I think there's a third guy, a Secretary of State of Virginia. 2 out of the 3, I believe, had Me Too issues, right? After the governor
Yes.
was seen in blackface in his college days or something, then they said, all right, let's go to the lieutenant governor. And then they found the lieutenant governor had Me Too issues. By the way, all those guys are still employed. How come? I don't know. I don't know the
Boeing,
answer.
It was interesting. Boeing hired someone to replace him who supposedly has crisis credentials. I thought that was a little bit late, but interesting.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I appreciate the woman speaking out, and I guess like in defense of you, I think you were just comparing about that sometimes you know some of those skeletons in the closet. I guess the Kevin Spacey example is like Gawker had written that he was a bad person forever ago. It's this idea that like companies taking a risk on someone, obviously very two different people. So again, I appreciate you speaking out, just kind of talking more high level about the risks from a brand company side.
I mean, if you look at the Charlie Rose situation, I mean, gosh, he was, you know, the sort of the in-joke among women and men at his company were, oh, that's just Charlie being Charlie. You know, getting an intern to his house and exposing himself, and, oh, it's just Charlie, you know, he's an old guy, don't worry about it. They knew this for years, they knew this. Come on. It's just, and they lived with it.
But there's been analysis that Bill Cosby and Roger Ailes were the catalyst that finally broke the dam when Weinstein came out.
Absolutely.
So the question is, in PR, how are we going to help them? How are we going to not help them? That's what we're talking about. The moral and societal issues are interesting, but we're talking about PR.
Yeah, well, I mean, as Melissa said in one point when I was talking about, you know, would somebody go up to the Boeing CEO and say, hey, we have a crisis here? You know, shake him and say, hey, we have a crisis here. Yeah, I mean, isn't that supposed to be the role of PR, sitting at the table, having this sort of moral compass, standing up for the public when they're looking at an ad campaign that maybe, you know, doesn't do nice things about minorities, women, et cetera, and saying, hey, wait a minute, we can't run that. That's going to cause a revolution on social media. That's supposed to be one of the roles of PR, but if PR is not at the table, it's hard to do that.
Well, they've mixed marketing and branding and
Yes,
advertising
yes,
and content with
yes,
PR. So
yes.
who's really sitting at the table
Right.
is the question. And yes,
Exactly.
they should have said something if it's that bad. Yes, they
Right.
should have.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think we have time for like one like last thoughts of Melissa, going back to what you said, I loved, and I think we just looped out there, Seth, is like this idea of like making sure the right stakeholders are in the right conversations. I love what you mentioned about bringing HR to the table too. Really, it's not just like PR, you know, needing to have a voice. It's also looking back and make sure you don't have any further like cultural explosions internally.
On that point, it's really stakeholders. Like, it's crisis management. Successful business is run and based off of relationships with human beings. Crisis management is about doing right by those human beings, by those relationships. That's what it comes down to, point final. And so to answer your question on, you know, how do we help them, how do we embed cultures that have zero tolerance policies and that actually play out as zero tolerance actions for anything that is in disalignment with our values, whether that's anything representative of discrimination, Me Too, sexual misconduct, all of that. And then for everything else, so that speaks to culture. And I mean, that also goes to kind of like, look at Wells Fargo, right? That was also a cultural crisis. So I'm putting cultural crisis in that same bucket of all of these, having a zero tolerance policy that is led with action from top down, bottom up. And then after that, it's looking at where are our high-risk scenarios, where are our vulnerabilities, because as human beings, we have them. As corporations run by human beings, we absolutely have them. Preventing the preventable, and then taking this crisis-ready deep dive approach and being ready for the unpreventable, whereby you have an entire, it's not about having a plan that sits stagnantly on a shelf, because I promise you that does not serve. It's about having an entire organization of people that understand what risk looks like, so how to detect it early on, be empowered to detect it early on, assess its material impact. Is this an issue or is this a crisis, and what does that mean? And then empowered to instinctively, trained instinctively to respond in a way that doesn't just de-escalate it and put it to bed, but actually where you do right by the people that you serve and you come out of it with increased brand equity. So, bottom line, that is very high level, but yes.
That's a great note to end on, and I unfortunately didn't leave time for questions, but luckily we're going into lunch, and I believe you guys will be sticking around. So if you did have any questions, honestly, please do go up to these wonderful people and ask anything. Thank you all for taking the time to be here, and enjoy your lunch.